Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so I am in Portland, Oregon right now. And I feel like there's gonna be some fans who are just like, how come you didn't do a fan meetup? Why didn't you tell anybody? Again, I'm actually on vacation here. And again, like the audio is probably gonna be kind of crappy. It's just really echoey in here. I mean, I'm in a hotel room, so you know, what all can you say? I don't have the sound treated space of my home. But in this one, we're picking up with Powers of X. Now, this one's kind of interesting because there is some cool stuff that happens here, but the big takeaway is actually one of the informational pages that Jonathan Hickman provides in the comic book itself. But one of the things this focuses on is it focuses on how it is that we kind of got to the present day, right? Like Charles Xavier and Magneto teaming up and working together. And that's one of the cool things, is because when it came to this, it's really Hickman kind of reworking a lot of things, especially when you get to like, when you have X-Men Year Zero, which is when the X-Men initially formed, then you have the X-Men in the modern day, and then you have like the X-Men 100 years from now, and then like the end of all things, like, you know, society in like 1,000 years or 10,000 years, whatever it is. It's kind of cool to see this whole thing play out. But what we saw in House of X was Moira McTaggart showing up and basically like revealing the truth to Charles Xavier that she had lived all these lives, and she had basically shown him like, hey, look, this is the future that awaits the X-Men, right? Like there really does not seem to be a scenario where like any of you guys win. The only way that seems to work is where you and Magneto basically work together, because at this point with these lives that she's lived, it doesn't look like she's experienced a reality whereby Xavier and Magneto came together. For whatever reason, really probably just the core of their differences and belief systems, it always led to like the destruction of the X-Men, presumably Charles Xavier first and then Magneto, or Magneto first and then Xavier, whatever the case happens to be. And so because of that, Xavier basically shows up at Island M, which is really more or less seems kind of be like a precursor to Genosha, and then essentially like reveals the truth to him and says, look, like in this world that we live in, there doesn't really seem to be a circumstance whereby our ideologies will work hand in hand, right? Like we have two diametrically opposing views on how it is that all of mutant kind needs to be dealt with in relation to like what's going on in the world right now. But at the end of the day, what Moira McTaggart showed me is that all of this really seems to just kind of be going to pot. That if we're going to survive, that we have to work together. And that's kind of the important thing that Xavier points out here, is that for him, it's not about survival, really. It's not about like, about Charles Xavier's survival. It's about basically creating a circumstance whereby the mutant population thrives and the mutant population continues to live on long beyond the two of them. And that's very far-sighted. It'd be very easy for him to kind of sit down and say like, I'm worried about right now, right? It's what most people do. It's what you and I do. It's what the average person does. Because of that, like it's a really, really cool concept when you look at this and then you kind of apply it to the nature of mutant kind, in the sense that it's not really about Xavier or Magneto, that it's about the survival of their race. And so that's when Xavier basically says, hey, look, let me show you these thoughts that Moira McTaggart gave me. And Magneto allows it to happen. And he's basically bombarded by like all these different scenarios, these scenarios where he's destroyed by Sentinels, these scenarios where he's captured by S.H.I.E.L.D. and held in stasis. And so ultimately it's Magneto coming to grips with the fact that nothing he does matters. And that's a huge revelation to have to undertake. It's a huge revelation that ultimately everything that he does is for naught, that he basically ends up getting destroyed, that it's all just a giant waste. And that's kind of a big thing. It's a massive thing, right? Like imagine if you woke up tomorrow and you found out that like you never amount to anything in your life. How crushing would that be? Now it's kind of a really good way to speak to Magneto's resolve when he basically says, okay, fine, this is how things are, then yes, we'll work together, right? It's not rolling over, it's not giving up, it's not saying, well, yeah, whatever, I guess it's just the way it goes. It's saying like, okay, like we have to work together and we have to get this going. And so what it does is it jumps to year 10, jumps to the present day, and you end up having what's called the Mother Mold. Now, this is an interesting concept, because in Marvel, you had Master Mold for a long time. And Master Mold was basically a Sentinel that created other Sentinels, right? It was this great big huge thing you guys saw in X-Men the animated series, but it was this great, like this huge robot that probably stood 500 feet tall, and it basically just sat like in this kind of chair that was built for it and just pumped out Sentinels. That's all it did, was just create Sentinels. And the result was that it was a much faster and more efficient way of building them than what was originally done by Bolivar Trask, where it was just like building them in a giant factory and then taking a long time to assemble them and all that kind of good stuff. And so what this is basically, it's Mother Mold in a sense that it's a master mold that makes other master molds. And that's kind of a crazy thing, because what this means is that humanity is rapidly gearing up for a war with mutant kind. And that's what this means. That's really the big takeaway from this moment here, is that when they basically grab this information, when Mystique and company that we saw in House of X grab this information and brought it to the X-Men, it's that exact piece of data that's going on. That basically humanity is ramping up and stockpiling as many arms and armament as they possibly can. And that's basically the stance of Xavier, is we have to go here and we have to destroy the Mother Mold. Otherwise, we're going to be painfully outmatched, right? And it's kind of a cool thing because this is very reminiscent of Days of Future Past, right? I mean, that's one of the things we've talked about. In Days of Future Past, the reason why the Sentinels were able to overpower the superhero community so readily was because there were just so many of them, right? I mean, if you were somebody like Magneto and you had this power of magnetism, then suddenly you'd be met by like a whole fleet, an armada of like plastic Sentinels, and they would just completely overwhelm you with unrelenting force. So instead of it being like, oh, there's a mutant down there and here's 2 or 3 Sentinels, suddenly it's like 200 or 300 Sentinels that just, or maybe like 20 or 30 or something like that, but they all just descend on you, and it's just a war of attrition, right? Eventually you just get worn down, and that's the nature of these things. That's why Sentinels are so dangerous, is because they don't get tired, they don't wear out, right? I mean, you can destroy them, but like they don't get exhausted, they don't run out of an energy supply, right? They're all like nuclear power. Their energy can just kind of go on forever and ever and ever. And so again, it's kind of a crazy thing. But from here we jump to the future, and we basically pick up with this piece of information that was gathered by the forces in the future, and they're in turn getting ready to launch their attack. And that's one thing I want you guys to notice, is that this is all about information being transferred from one person to another, right? So it's the information that Moira McTaggart has that's been given to Charles Xavier, which has now been given to Magneto, and that's how they work together. Then it's the information of, you know, this governmental facility that was accessed by Mystique and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which was handed over to Cyclops and Charles Xavier. And now you have this information from the future, which is handed over to none other than Apocalypse. And it's kind of crazy because now this means that Apocalypse is currently running the X-Men. And it really kind of begs the question of, what does that mean for the team? Because if this is 100 years from now, we can largely assume that the X-Men as we know them are basically dead, right? Like Charles Xavier's dead, Magneto's dead, they're all dead and gone. And it's kind of a cool thing here because this information, which what they were sent in there for, was a particular bit of information, but the problem was it was like finding a needle in a haystack. And this huge catalog of data that exists out there, you have to go find this one thing. And that's like an impossible feat to achieve, right? So what they did instead of them going in there blind and searching through all these files trying to find a piece of information, they can steal the codex, decipher the codex, and the codex will say it's that way, it's right here, it's in this location. And once they break it down and once they decipher it, then in turn they realize where this piece of information is, and they have to go and access it. The problem is they had Blackout, a member of their group, the one who was basically whisked away. She was the one that basically made them invisible to the machines. And so now they have to go in there and then be seen. And so essentially they're going to go into this place, alarms are going to be blaring, they have to fight their way in, they have to secure the information and then fight their way out. And as Wolverine says, it's a death sentence. But then Apocalypse speaks up and says, no, I will lead you there. And so what this looks like is this looks like the precursor for the future that we saw with Moira McTaggart, where like Apocalypse is obliterated by the forces of humanity. And that's entirely possible here. It's kind of a cool and a crazy little thing here, because then what you do is you jump to 1,000 years into the future and you have this kind of whatever this happens to be, whether it's humans or mutants or what have you, but basically like they're met by this giant dark sphere, right, that kind of shoots out this little black ink or whatever it is. And when it starts to speak to them, which is almost reminiscent of the Beyonders, for those of you guys who read Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, when it starts to speak to them, what this being says is what we're looking for is ascension. And that's when things really begin to get kind of crazy, because what this does is it breaks down into how Hickman defines societies in Marvel Comics based on technology, right? It's one of the important things here. When he says, you know, like societal intelligence 1, that's a machine. But notice all of this is tied into a machine. It's tied into like robots and so on and so forth. Now, this seems to be something that carries over to like humans, like biological organisms, and you probably could. But with regards to this, it's like a single machine, a robot that has average intelligence, right? So I think at this point he's kind of making the assumption, or just kind of going with the idea of like artificial intelligence, meaning a machine that can think for itself, or at the very least, maybe something just like a baseline sentinel. And then from there you have a hive, right? So like a collection of machines all sort of working together where it's greater than the sum of its parts. And then you have your intelligence. Now, intelligence is cool because this is basically his way of saying the supreme intelligence is basically a robot. And it's kind of a cool thing, right? Because the supreme intelligence really always was. The supreme intelligence was always a robot of sorts, insofar as it was an organism that was plugged into the brains of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of the smartest people to ever exist in the Kree society. And then in turn, it can make decisions accordingly. Now, it is biological insofar as like there's blood and there's flesh and different things like that, and like it can bleed and so on. But in terms of how it functions, it really is more machine in the sense that like it's a singular organism that exists out there, and it's an amalgam of a ton of other minds that it can use for its own purpose to achieve a particular goal. Now from there you move beyond planetary, and then you start getting into galactic, and this is when you get into things like the Technarch. Now the Technarch is a really cool change by Jonathan Hickman, and the reason why is because this ties directly into the Technarchy Fury, and then Warlock and Magus. And the reason why is in the 1990s, you had a character by the name of Warlock who was just kind of like this really crazy looking guy in terms of like, you know, this stuff sticking out of him and so on and so forth. But the idea behind this was that it showed up and actually had the ability to convert any kind of substance into a technarch, like something it could absorb, right? And so it was essentially the son of what was called, well, I guess a being called Magus, who was like the super powerful being. And it was from a planet, I always called it Ketch. I don't know if that's really the correct way to pronounce it. And the result was that it just kind of went forward and then eventually became a good guy and an ally of the X-Men and so on and so forth. And maybe, and a lot of it was because of the fact that like originally Warlock was like fleeing the planet of his father and so on and so forth. What Hickman's doing is coming along and saying, no, none of that stuff that we've seen is what we think it is. Instead, Warlock and Magus and the planet Ketch and all that kind of stuff, that's one facet of a multitude of concepts that are called the technarch. Basically, there's a lot of different variations of Warlock out there. There's a lot of different variations of Magus out there, and they all come from a planet that's seemingly called a Ketch, right? So the idea behind this is that they're not the only ones out there. The reason why we've never seen them is because no technarch can see another technarch. It's kind of weird in terms of like how they were designed and how they were created, but the idea behind this is they were made for the purpose of basically going through and like removing life on planets. And the reason why is because when it comes to the phalanx themselves, and this is kind of an interesting thing too, I want to talk about that here in a second. When it comes to the phalanx, the way that Hickman really sort of purports it is that it's a group of organisms that go around and essentially deem different planets as worthy of being incorporated into their group, into their collective. If you guys ever watch Star Trek, those who were deemed worthy are absorbed into it. Those who were not deemed worthy are wiped away by the technarch. That's the purpose the technarch serves. And the reason why that matters is because what Hickman says here is he doesn't say the phalanx is an interstellar society. He says a phalanx is an interstellar society. And that wording is particularly important because what this means is that it seems as though the phalanx is the highest state of intelligence that a particular organism can achieve, a point at which there is no differentiation between machine and man. Instead, it's just a super high level evolved organism. And the result is that when he says a phalanx, he may just simply be saying it for the sake of the explanation, and there really is only one phalanx race out there. Or it could be that this is simply just a super high level of achievement, right? Only one group has achieved the level of phalanx so far, but others can follow if given enough time. And it's kind of a cool thing. It's a really, really cool concept because it's a way to sort of take this entire idea of like machines, intelligence, and so on and so forth, and just kind of roll it all into like this really nice packaged, organized bundle, and then send it off to us as the reader. I really dig it. I'm absolutely loving it. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Core. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.